again, it's Count Steiner. Today we're going to be talking about wraps. So in order to talk about this properly, we need a little bit of sword terminology. So on the sword, where the knuckle is, this is called the true edge, and the back is called the false edge. So when we do a wrap, we start cutting on the true edge and then end on the false edge. So keep this in mind when I'm talking. Okay, to start with, let's just try and figure out how a wrap is supposed to feel. If you put the sword on your shoulder and then just let it fall off in an arc, there'll be a point somewhere in that swing where your wrist wants to naturally roll over to the other side. You don't need to do anything special with your arm. Your hand naturally kind of figures out that this is where it should turn so it doesn't hurt its own wrist. It's easy to do when this is just falling off your shoulder because you don't have to worry about keeping your sword up or anything. Gravity does most of the work and your hand just takes over. So once you get that feel, you need to know that you don't need to raise your elbow or turn your wrist or do whatever to make it flip. It's going to happen if you relax your wrist. When dropping the sword off your shoulder and letting it roll down at the bottom starts to become comfortable, you can start thinking about raising your arm slightly each time you swing down. So eventually you end at sort of like a head height wrap level. I generally don't teach people how to wrap using this method, but for some people it's the only way they really understand how things turn and roll, and it's the only way they can get the shot to work. At its core, a wrap is a true edge cut that transitions to a false edge cut. The trick is determining where the transition between the two states happen. When most people start learning wraps, they try and start the transition from true edge to false edge from the moment the shot begins. This is hard on the joints, easy to read, and kills your power. So you want to stay on that true edge for most of the shot and only transition near the end. To determine where that transition should start, place your hand on the pel in the position you want the wrap to finish. Then, without moving your hand, roll your wrist back in the direction you want the shot to come from. Visualize an imaginary target in the position of that goal. Now wind your arm back to the starting position like we did in the flat snap video. From there, you're going to want to initiate a wrap by throwing a snap at that target. All the power of a wrap is generated during the true edge portion of the wrap, and once you start the transition to false edge, it's basically ballistic and just finishes on its own. So when you throw a clean snap at that target and don't allow your hand to travel any closer to your target, your hand will have the time to roll into the wrap finish. Sometimes in practice, I like to use my shield arm to point my finger at the space in the air where my hand should finish. That way I can tell if I'm rotating past that point. Virtually every problem I fix with people doing this shot is that their hand moves too close to the pel. So if you're landing flat on the side of the blade, really look at where you're ending with your hand. You can see in this that once my hand starts rolling, it's basically glued in place. You can throw this shot slow, you don't have to be at full speed. But once you've got the hang of it, know that the harder you throw that snap portion of the shot, the harder the wrap will finish. It's really important that the tip travels in a smooth arc from the start position to the end position. The angle of the blade on impact determines where the path of that arc should be. So when things start getting more interesting in a wrap, it's about changing the angles that they come in on. So say I want to do a wrap that comes from up top and ends up digging into the top of the shoulder. I need to figure out the arc that the sword needs to travel. So if I'm following it forward and backwards, this is going to bring it in to the shoulder. Now if I want to say throw a low shot that ends up high in the ribs, I can do the reverse. I tuck it up here, I turn it, and I bring it down, because this is the path that it's going to travel on and end up in the ribs. Once you start figuring out the angle that the sword is coming in is going to determine how the wrap finishes, you can do some really interesting things. Like say I wanted to throw an offside wrap, I can figure out the path that the sword needs to travel in and end up in a wrap. Same with like a sky hook.